Welcome again to our Deloitte Banking Trend Radar webcast. It's now the number 6. So we already had a lot for very interesting topics the last times. As always, you can view the records, the videos of the sessions on our Deloitte internet webpage. So for today, that might be the reason that we really have a big audience today. Climate transition planning, how banks can profit from credible climate and decarbonization strategies. So for me, really one of the hot topics for the banks in the next decade and ongoing. So I think for every bank globally, it is a topic, and every bank has to think about that. Why? So let me allow me please some personal non-expert comments at first. So why is it a trend, and why is it important for banks? Because banks are not that companies who have the biggest carbon footprint in the world, but banks, let me say it as someone who has more than 35 years experience in banks, in auditing and advising banks. Banks are always in the middle between the investors and the projects, right? So banks have in these road to net zero a really big task to drive that forward. And we all know that data are still a bit missing to take care with their investments, with the portfolios of banks to manage that. But that will be in a better position very soon. So if banks already have these data available, why not using them much more strategically to do business and to put it more into their own strategy? And now coming to our experts, so very happy to have Nicole Röttmer and Katharina Käsehage today with us. Nicole, Managing Director Partner in our sustainability and climate initiatives, very much linked to the sector, to the banking sector. A lot of discussions, also more than 20 years experience in a strategic setup of banks, also for the climate change and regulatory talking, not just helping, but also discussing with politicians about this climate change and the role of banks in it. The same Katharina Käsehage, Senior Manager in our practice, and also very experienced, more than 12 years in that area. So I'm really happy to have you today. So handing over to you. So I'm very excited to learn the next 40-50 minutes more about that climate transition. What should banks do? How could banks profit from that? So please, Nicole, Katharina.
Thanks a ton, Thomas. And thanks everybody for your time and attention. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Let me start by saying transition planning effectively is business planning. So we are talking about a business plan that we leverage in the context of climate, and then we need to build into the broader strategic discussion in organizations and the broader ecosystem trends. Why are we doing this, and why would it be business relevant? The ambition that comes with climate is A, navigating value creation in the process of a net zero transition, B, managing the risks, so safeguarding for disruption that might arise in your portfolio, specifically due to climate transition, and then obviously to make both ends meet, build the transition plan for yourself in what are the actions that you want to take, how do you fund it, how do you create the governance around it. We do hear a lot around climate at this point in time, a lot around the political embedding around the votes that are going on. It's a major voting year, as you see wherever you look at the press. At the same time, we already have some close to 1,000 listed companies with net zero targets. 88% of carbon emissions are covered by net zero targets, and 92% of the GDP. We are seeing, as I mentioned, a lot of political discussions at the same time, and that partially comes a little more unnoticed. We do see massive action regarding, for example, hydrogen planning, infrastructure plans, national strategies, regional strategies that come into play, China overtaking what we would have expected in hydrogen build out, for example. So a massive push into new markets. We see financing discussions going on in the context of COP. It will be a major topic on this current COP. It has been in the last one, for example, with the Just Energy Transition partnerships that have led to major investments in the global south already. So acknowledged and confirmed plans that are out there. We are talking about technology progress, depending on the sector that you're talking about. For EVs, in 2022, we had 30% of the global new cars that are being issued as EV cars. We wouldn't have the trade barrier conversation if there wouldn't be a major pickup and a major cost advantage and overcapacities already in the markets. So we see that some of these transition trends start overtaking what we would have expected and what partially national leaders had expected in the past. So in the context of that, to build a strong plan and balance yourself, and we'll talk about this a lot more in this webcast today, what is critical is to identify where to provide transition finance. We might not always meet the 1.5 commitments in the key sectors, but nonetheless, where is the value in providing transition finance? Where's the value in capturing new markets and new market shares in areas that are coming into play while we talk right now? But then also how to integrate it into the DNA of the organization. We'll talk about regulation in a second, but that's also in the own interest to say, how do I align my risk processes with my strategic ambition and my market processes in a consistent manner that I can really follow through on, especially new markets where I might need to build capacity and capabilities. The last one is the strategic anchoring. So how do I trade off what is coming out of this climate discussion and trade it off with other trends? That might be sustainability, but in many cases it will be around digital, it will be around macroeconomic trends, demographic trends. So all of this needs to come together on the board level to then be able to build a strategic framework. I mentioned regulation already. If we jump to the following page. Why is this relevant? I just made the argument around there's a business case behind it, which might be and very likely is positive, so value creation, but there's also one around risk mitigation. We do see pressure on disclosure, and you've seen this coming up in the past around the TCFD requirements, which were risk-centric from the start, but obviously look at opportunities as well. We see it as examples under IFRS, we see it under the CSRD in the European context, Singapore's discussion in the SEC regulation guidelines that will very likely go to the Supreme Court. There's conversations around disclosing climate risks. And then obviously when you talk about risks, you might want to talk about the opportunity as well, to ensure that your company is well positioned or your financial institution is well positioned relative to investors, investor communication. We see it in a lot of the global south areas coming up as diverse and nonetheless focused regulation around disclosure on transition planning. We see it indirectly as well, which I guess was quite surprising for some institutions. And I want to point out this example on the right-hand side of the CSDDD, so Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which moves into supply chains and embeds net zero pathway communication across the supply chain. So it's coming from very different directions. We have a range of initiatives from the past. You see it on the bottom side, just as some examples around how to think about transition planning. This is not exclusive. It's one of the kind of areas to consider. And I think what's important as well is with every disclosure, we're establishing a new level playing field. A lot of the conversations we currently have in the global banking community are around where do I need to position myself right now so that I'm maybe not ahead of the market in some areas that I'm ahead of the market, but then at least not behind everybody else. So with every disclosure, and if you look at, for example, what rating agencies start doing, there will be a new level playing field relative to everybody else. So the question is, what do I want to communicate at this point in time? And how does that position me in the eye of an investor, for example, but also a regulator moving forward? One last thought, and this is something I want to mention just because it has been such an intense discussion in the past, on capital requirements. This is a conversation that is still going on in the EU, for example, on Pillar 2. There might be Pillar 1 conversions as well. So that conversation still isn't over. So we basically see that the real economy is changing and it might not reach 1.5, but there's so much dynamics in the markets that we'll definitely see a shift and a value in how to behave relative to this change that we're seeing. There is a disclosure requirement, and there definitely, relative to regulators, relative to the public, relative to investor, in need to align and discuss where do you want to be positioned as financial institutions moving forward. Thomas, over to you.
Well, the question is, why is trend and how it's driven? So we just discussed it a little bit and come to that later, but maybe to the audience, we have included in our webcast today also a Menti. So we try to make it as easy as possible for you. So you just have to open your mobile and scan the code here, and then you should directly land at a short questionnaire. But Katharina, Nicole, maybe you can route us through the questions or through the options here.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Also, thank you very much to everybody for joining today from my side. So exactly, we brought a number of questions just to help us get the discussion going and also kind of help us guide along throughout our presentation. And so some questions that we also talk to banks a lot about and we'll talk about throughout the presentation is one of the first questions is, what measures and impact do you already have, and do you perform to assess your financial impact of net zero pathways? So basically looking into what is it that you're already doing. Then also consider the second question, which functions of your organizations do you not involve in the process of sustainable transformation? So it might be a bit of a tricky question. And then the last one is, which analysis have you already been doing in terms of forecasting sustainable development and preparing for future business model? So I'm going to let that sink a little bit and also give you some time to kind of scan the code and give you a chance to think about it. And we'll get back to these questions throughout the presentation and pick it out at different points. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this link works for everybody. And so we'll just continue while you kind of think about the questions and fill them in through the Menti. Okay, so we heard two terms already today, transition plan and transition planning. And there's actually a really important differentiation between the two. So first of all, we have transition planning and we have transition plan. Transition plan is what you communicate to your stakeholders and to the outside world. Transition planning is all the activities that you do that kind of feed into the transition plan, but also activities that support your transition plan that you don't necessarily want to talk about. Why is that difference really important is that, well, first of all, sometimes if you look into the transition plans from your competitors, for example, it doesn't mean that that's all they're doing. What we're kind of seeing is that transition plans really publish what you want to disclose and what you want to talk about. But a lot of banks already get a lot of things ready and they do a lot of different activities in terms of net zero and also climate risk, and they don't yet feed into the transition plan. So it's important to kind of act now and get your stuff together now and get ready with your transition planning so that you have enough to talk about in your transition plan, and also so that you can consider really carefully what you want to integrate in your transition plan. So basically my key message is, just because you see maybe not so much in some transition plans, it doesn't mean that's all your competitors or other banks are doing. That they most likely are doing a lot more than what we're seeing. And kind of it's also kind of a motivation to spend a lot of time with your transition planning, think about it strategically, get your internal processes ready, think about your risks and opportunities associated with that, and then move the important bits that you really want to talk about into your transition plan. So I think one kind of important question that might come up when we talk about transition planning and transition plan is, how do you really ensure that you have a credible transition plan and that you feel really comfortable with transition planning? And that's also something that we're kind of seeing with banks that they're really concerned about. So there's basically 7 key themes that, well, there are kind of challenges when you write a transition plan. And to maybe highlight 2 or 3 of them, the first thing is that you really want to think about really critically is, what do you believe in and what do you want to position yourself up in terms of net zero. And another thing that often comes up is the question around data and metrics, what data to collect, what data to use. And associated with that is, how do you then consider climate performance metrics with other financial performance metrics? Another question that that banks are concerned about is kind of organizational integration. And Nicole was talking a lot about, it's really important that you integrate your transition plan within your strategy and within your business decision making. And so these are the things, the themes, the challenges that kind of come up when you consider writing a transition plan, and also if you look into existing transition plans. And what we actually found running a study with the IIF, International Institute for Finance, is that there's actually a lot of safeguards that you can apply to make sure your transition plan is really credible before you kind of start talking about it. And so the first one is to really set ambitious goals and use leading standards and look into what is the best practice at the moment. Also kind of think about using sector-specific targets, but also then be really transparent in terms of what you talk about, what kind of scientific basis you use and how you position yourself. Then the second, in terms of climate and other financial performance indicators, it's really important to integrate net zero goals with other business rationales, and also consider that certain business decision making can impact negatively some of your targets, achieving targets that you have set. So be really kind of transparent within your organization in terms of communicating what kind of targets you've set, and be aware of interdependencies of decision making. In terms of data and metrics, again, really important to use existing frameworks and then also develop your own criteria in terms of how you, for example, assess your clients. In terms of target, scope, and coverage, consider different types of clients that you have, and also mapping and tracking their progress. Also considering maybe some clients do not fit, or you need to address them differently in terms of helping them achieve targets. In terms of organizational integration, we've learned that it's really important to integrate, also like Nicole already said, your target setting, but also your kind of what you talk about, what you communicate within your organization, especially your board. Update them regularly, and align your decision making with your overall business goals and your overall sustainability goals. And then last, decide really carefully what you want to disclose, and what you disclose, be clear, transparent, but also make sure that you update regularly on the progress that you're making. So I think we can take a look at the Menti. Nicole, I just saw that we've got some updates, so I'm going to hand over to you, Nicole.
Thanks a ton, Katja. We did talk about the key, let's say, success factors, what is really relevant, what has been most of a pain point to banks as part of the IIF study, for example. I really like the results, so thanks for participating. This is really exciting. Key questions always are around what is my framing when I talk about climate? And what we've seen historically is that we, as a global community, out of the G20 conversations, TCFD, etc., we're coming from a risk objective perspective. A lot of the European banks were forced to go through first stress tests, for example, so risk assessment was quite prominent in the global north. In conversations with the global south, we found a lot more focus on the market side. So a somewhat differential embedding of climate in the risk function and on the market side. I really like the results here around the dynamic balance sheet assessment, because that is kind of across the board something that we still feel is less prominent in current practices. And one of these key points to say, how do I really get this into my board conversation and make it a cross-functional topic moving forward? What we've brought with us today are just a few examples on why the market side is so strong. We see a little bit less emphasis here on the market need. And I would just like to leave some two thoughts around this with you today, and then talk a little bit about this dynamic balance sheet assessment and show you some of the results out of the ECB stress test, which is also public material, so you can access this later on as well, before we move into the second Menti question. So if we move a slide ahead. What we're currently seeing is, and that's a clean tech example, so clean technology, EIA data, public. What we're seeing is that regions are at this point in time setting themselves up in terms of future market share. Future here in this example is 2030, so not that far out anymore, basically 5 years. And we see that what you see on the left-hand side always in these pillars is what is the current market and then the project pipeline to achieve what theoretically should be there under EIA scenario assumptions for net zero in the different technologies. The interesting piece is around how much of the market shares are already captured and what came up in terms of the pipeline and who is already capturing these market shares. So we already see, for example, for solar, massive Chinese market share, strong project pipeline. We're not fully there yet, but very close to already having contracted what should be out ideally in 2030. So if we talk about development speed and then renewable capacities globally, still a surprise. Every year assumptions have been updated and it's a distribution of market share. For wind, not as strong, but nonetheless, again, very strong Chinese market shares. Batteries, interesting finding here. What you see in green is the US, and the reason why the project pipeline grew for the US was basically the Inflation Reduction Act. So something that we're positioning under a different header that nonetheless has led to this significant increase of the expected US market share in the 2030 battery market. So again, it's a redistribution of market shares, future market shares that we're seeing, where climate is one consideration, but obviously it's around kind of how do we trade and where do we build industrial capacity for the future and where do we keep IP for the future. What we still could differentiate and distribute more clearly are electrolyzer capacities. I talked briefly about hydrogen. So again, the last COP has seen first thoughts around how do I trade hydrogen, how do I establish global certification, how do I build the hubs. Could we please jump back to the previous slide? Thank you. And then on the heat pump element, again, still a pretty strong European share in the build out, but obviously also some discussions around selling companies, etc., globally. We see that similarly on the right-hand side, and that's also quite interesting in the sense of for whom am I building this market share? So what is my domestic demand in green, yellow, relative to what the expected announced supply is that is resulting from the products that are in place. And again, interesting role in China at this point in time, producing basically for the world. Then if we translate it, the slide just already came up in terms of hydrogen. That's just one example of how to think about these markets that are coming up in the future. So who will be building which type of infrastructure? What are the national roadmaps that are already in place? What would be the pipeline requirements, shipping requirements that are coming in? What are the pricing differentials that we see also with the renewables build out? And then this translation quite practically into what does it mean for my client portfolio? And what type of financing offer can I make at which point in time? As I mentioned, we might be lower right now in the US and in Europe, but massive uptake in Asia. So it's not that things wouldn't happen. And the last strategy from the EU has just recently been released around this one, also in connection with CCS and CCU. If we talk about the financials and the integration, if we move the slide ahead, please. This is just an example for you around interest income from carbon-intensive industries, and then interest, fee, and commission incomes per sector, and the kind of median development. So if I look at that in my own portfolio, and some of you have mentioned that you go into dynamic balance sheet assessments, this helps me quite a bit think about where do I want to earn, and can I earn money in the future? Also given, and that's one of the risks of the transition planning at this point in time, and the international standardization that Katja has indicated, where a lot of institutions are leveraging EIA data. It basically means more banks are shifting into very similar technologies and companies, and that will have an impact on what is my interest income that I can achieve, and then fee and commission income, and where would I need to rebalance my portfolio and build new capacity and new positions basically to capture, to accommodate for the change, and then capture additional market share moving forward. With that, let's talk about organizational integration. Kati, back to you.
Perfect. So we have some new Mentee results, and I find the results really interesting because they're so diverse. So here the question was, which function of your organization is not involved in the process of sustainable transformation? And I maybe just highlight a few. So a few have stated strategies, for example, not involved in the sustainability team, but also here the board has been mentioned a number of times. And I think it's really interesting because what we kind of are seeing, or if we kind of go back, let's say 10, 15 years when climate change first became a thing to consider within business decision making, it used to be very, very much standalone a topic, and sometimes not even within the sustainability team. It was really separated. And I think what we're seeing here, and what also has been mentioned throughout our presentation, is that a really credible transition plan needs to make sure that it's cross-functional, and it's really informed by different types of decision makers within the organization. And so, for example, we mentioned the board already needs to be standing behind what we promise in our transition plans, needs to be integrated in business goals and also business rationale. So therefore also strategy needs to be involved. But of course also very surprising sustainability team has been mentioned here. So it seems to be that sometimes it can be very fragmented, and also that's something we're seeing, but we're seeing a trend also that's shifting. So we're trying to get different functions to really talk to each other in terms of getting data ready, getting making sure that dependencies kind of don't impact each other negatively, or at least kind of inform each other so that better decisions can be made, and so on. So I think, yeah, just maps a really interesting picture. Nicole.
Thank you. If we move to the next Mentee overview, that one was around how do you think about and forecast sustainability developments, and how do you prepare for the business model? This is a finding, in all honesty, that I haven't seen before. What we tend to see is partially tech analyses for some of the sectors that you might have commitments to, less sector policy analyses, so a lot of confusion in the market around, are we still moving anywhere? We have all the kind of geopolitics at this point in time that might supersede any type of climate action. Sector market analyses partially, but not systematically. What I would like to show to you, just as one example, that's again public data. It's work that we're doing with an applicable policy response under the UNPRI for the investment community. Sorry that this looks a bit complex. There's online data behind it, and you can take a look at quarterly, and then the annual report that will be released end of this year. What it does show you is for the key industries, so economy-wide, I'm going through the top line here, economy-wide, and then for power, buildings, transport, industry, agri, land use, and nature, given the really strong impact on carbon emissions, and then per key countries globally, when they would, under current expectations, so forecasted, reach net zero. in the different dimensions. So it basically allows for a sector-based tracking, for an overarching carbon price, so ecosystem tracking, and emissions net zero target tracking, basically relative to what we see here in the forecast. To give you an idea around per country, what can I expect in the policy environment, per sector, where do I reach sector tipping points, and are we still on track, and what are the key changes that come out of the regulatory space? Just to highlight a few, in the agriculture, land use, nature space, massive action in the global south, a lot more than most people would expect. Indirect actions through, for example, EU regulation as well, but also the US kicking in. Deforestation as a key topic that has been very highly discussed, but then also on transport, buildings, power, very, very differential action in the regions. Two things that I'd like to mention, just because we have a lot of kind of hesitation in the European space right now. So emission reductions on trucking, so heavy road transport, which most people hadn't expected over the past basically 20 years, are now in place. We see the carbon removal scheme that has just been legislated. Online, you find a lot more of what is literally happening on a day-by-day basis. So something that you can easily use. I understand that typically we talk about why is it a trend and how should we assess it at the beginning. Let me basically close with this if we move a slide ahead. For us, it's an act. Why is it an act? Because the influence is high. Let me say, cite data from the European Central Bank as one example. So 80% of the European area banks have mentioned that climate has a material impact on their strategy and risk profile, and the very vast majority is currently underlined in their portfolio. So we see that there is a gap and that there is a reason why also financial market regulators are asking these nasty questions around risk profiles. We always talk about what is the tipping point, and do you want to be ahead of the curve? Do you want to use and leverage the opportunity that is being created at this point in time, which requires fast action? So we do see major opportunity as well. In terms of mainstream adoption, the past year has witnessed the release of quite a bit of kind of large banking transition plans already, independent of the regulation that comes into play. I mentioned CSRD, you have a broad overview, and there's also more in the IIF paper that we've released jointly. So regulation is kicking in. If we look at the kind of global trade-off and the increasing transparency, having a view on your own organization definitely helps. Thus, for us, you could consider it a prepare, but for us, it's really an act because it's not that easy to get a consistent view board aligned into place. So if action doesn't come now, you won't have enough time to prepare anymore from our perspective. If we look at focus areas, last point, next slide, please. What we've seen in the kind of global overview is, yes, we need, if we want to build transition plans, we need to orient ourselves in the climate land space and then the new regulatory domain. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there's a lot of papers that are coming out at this point in time around who wants what from whom, so which regulator, which public stakeholder, etc., wants to see what. There isn't a single standard yet, so there is some work to do in terms of orienting yourself and then picking and playing what you want to position in the market and what you want to be known for. In terms of common approaches, let's make it easy. For credibility, a lot of the standards are already being set. On scoping, we see emerging standards, data is set, targets are set, metrics are largely set, leverage what is there. From our perspective, it's really, really hard to fight against that, and it makes it less credible and less transparent. So just use what is there. And then in terms of the kind of upcoming integration into processes, we see that some of the opportunities can only be captured if, for example, you also transform the way that your risk function is operating. So having this eye on what does it mean in terms of internal transformation, that you're fast enough in the market, is another key learning that we would like to share with you today. With that, thanks a lot, and Thomas, over to you.
Well, Nicole, Katharina, thank you very, very much for these insights. And I think we all can see how important it is to think about these climate change or opportunities for banks now and not just in 2, 3, 5 years. So thank you very much for that. And please, we open the Q&A. please, everyone with questions, just post it in. In the meantime, maybe allow me to have the first question. So we talked a lot about these transition planning, transition plans. How can banks benefit from in terms of business from the carbon change? But can you tell us a little bit about the difference between this business strategy for sustainability and a transition plan?
Okay, I can jump in. This is a very, very good question. I'm literally coming out of a very intense conversation last night around how to work on the transformation of the automotive sector and how to finance it moving forward. So what would be an ideal transition plan? So I think generally a climate transition plan, it was possible in the past years to think about climate transition separately. We're no longer in that position to do that, that we have to have a trade-off with other dimensions. A lot of emphasis on this is being placed in the global south, but obviously also in the global north in terms of unemployment, etc. So on the social side, so it is around balancing. It's what's the different taxonomies that are globally emerging. I think we by now have some 25 different taxonomies that have come up. That's something that the taxonomies wants to balance as well. In terms of implementing this as a financial institution, it obviously does create quite some complexity. So focusing on a climate transition plan, having the trade-offs right in your own mind and where you want to transition and not is crucial. I personally see a lot more willingness in the market and increasing capacity and capability in the market to discuss how you have set trade-offs moving forward. So use that when you talk about the transition plan. What we see as best practices is also, if you, for example, say, I've been setting a target that would be aligned. To be able to do that, I need the following 5 things. Or I've decided against setting a target for the following reason, because we're trading off with other, for example, sustainability criteria or with the broader market, and we don't see at this point in time that this would be credible for us to commit. So integrating these trade-offs is definitely crucial.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. While doing that, what do you think? I mean, the bank is again not building up goods or not selling goods, are selling services and banking services to clients. So in all that business strategy and transition planning in this topic, do you think that the portfolio companies, the group of a bank, but also should the bank include their customers, their clients into their planning?
Yeah, I can go first and then Nicole, you can join. So yeah, it's really important to integrate clients in the transition plan. After all, they are also the ones that need to transition. And therefore, yeah, it's really important to get data from them, integrate their performances or understand their performances, also help them transition, nudge them forward to kind of provide information. I think that's first and foremost always the first barrier. Help educate them why this data and information is needed, but also nudge them into the right direction in terms of what you are seeing and what you believe they should be doing so that they fit into your kind of portfolio that you're trying to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Thanks. We have the first question, our Q&A. I read it. Can transition financing and transition finance be interrelated here in that area? Maybe it's linked. A little bit linked to a discussion I had yesterday with someone who's managing buildings, but also organizing, ramping up buildings or projects to renovate bridges, streets, all these kind of things. So he said it's more and more common that also these project finance for these projects, not just for the end investors, but for the project itself, the 2, 3, 4 years, is more and more planned to be carbon zero or maybe less carbon, and that is more and more managed. So maybe that is also related to this kind of question. So interrelation between transition financing and transition finance.
Maybe let me pick up one point here. There were several initiatives going on around what are the right definitions and what do I do with the different activities. We've looked at it as one of the implementation actions, for example, of a net zero plan in the context of the IIF study. And what we've seen is, if you look at the disclosure that is out there, a lot of the institutions take their own definitions of how they define transition finance and how they define their contribution, which is exactly due to this ambiguity that is out there and to the greenwashing risk that we see in the market, just looking at past experiences. So I think just being clear on where do I have an impact and being able to make it tangible, similar to the example that you just gave, right? It's very, very easy to measure the emission footprint of a building or of an infrastructure. Just be super clear, when do I have a contribution? How do I measure it? And then take that into official reporting is absolutely one of the stage gates that is and are required.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we are pretty much to the end, so I see no further question in the Q&A. I hope that means that everyone was clear during the presentation. So I personally learned a lot about how can banks profit on that way in the climate change. And I think it's not just me, it's also our participants, hopefully, that we get a lot of ideas about new business for banks, about also, I like that allocation on the regions, so how far the regions globally on that change. I think that's very, very necessary to consider if you plan as a global bank in which region will you establish new services on that way. So I think very, very helpful. Thank you very much for that. So thank you very much, participants, to join us today. Again, we recorded the session, and you will see it in the next days on our internet page, so you can go through our webcast again, see it again. And like always, a little bit forward-looking to our next one. So next one will be with our experts, Martin Hirdreiter, Robert Schmuck, in financial crime. So financial crime also an ongoing topic for everyone, for every bank. But that changed in terms of processes, in terms of effectiveness. More AI is also coming in that field. That's why it's called a little bit revolutionization of financial crime prevention. So happy to welcome you also on the next webcast. It will take place 28th of November, the same time as always, 2 p.m. Europe time. And yeah, thank you very much for today, for your participation, and looking forward to see you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will stop our recording now.